series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
The highest point of tension amid the Cold War came during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a period of 13 days in October of 1962 when the U.S. and Soviet Union confronted over Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The first day was October 16th, when President Kennedy was briefed about a U-2 plane's findings that the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. On October 23rd, the U.S. placed a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba. The crisis came to an end on October 28th when the Soviet Union and the U.S. publicly agreed on a deal outlining that the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange that the U.S. pledged to not invade Cuba and that the U.S. remove their missiles from Turkey, the Turkey part not made public immediately. A nuclear Armageddon was avoided in October of 1962 because the leadership of Kennedy and Khrushchev was highlighted by an understanding of each other and the danger of the situation. Khrushchev's dismissal of Castro and Kennedy's dismissal of his advisors was also essential. The legacy left behind by the resolution of the crisis is a series of actions taken to reduce the presence of nuclear arms around the world and an understanding of how to best deal with major dilemmas. The Cold War was a state of political and military hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union. The two superpowers had conflicting political systems, and each wanted to prove to the rest of the world that they were the strongest country. After World War II, they disagreed on the division of Germany and the communization of the rest of Europe. Starting from 1952, nearly all European countries had either joined NATO, a security pact formed in 1949 against communism, or the Warsaw Pact, a communist group formed in 1952. Turkey, after joining NATO, was seen to have many strategic advantages because of its location, so in 1959, the U.S. placed a nuclear missile base in Turkey. In January 1959, Fidel Castro and his followers overthrew the president of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, and a year later, Castro sided with the Soviets as opposed to the U.S. In return, on January 3, 1961, the U.S. froze all Cuban assets on American soil, severed diplomatic ties, and tightened its embargo on Cuba. Later, on April 14, 1961, Kennedy authorized a failed covert invasion known as the Bay of Pigs on Cuba that sent 1,400 anti-Castro exiles to overthrow the Cuban government and the pro-Soviet Fidel Castro. Less than 2 weeks after the invasion, Castro gave a speech in which he said, "The U.S. government says that a socialist regime here threatens U.S. security, but what threatens the security of the North American people is the aggressive policy of the warmongers of the United States." Castro, after the U.S.'s attempted murder of him during the Bay of Pigs, and with the U.S. recon planes flying less than 100 feet above his island, firmly believed the U.S. was planning a larger invasion on Cuba, and therefore requested nuclear missiles from the Soviet Union. The Soviets deployed the missiles to protect Cuba, as well as to counter the U.S. missiles in Turkey. Once the crisis arose, each leader had their own desires, and because of the opposing desires, each had their own predicament. Kennedy wanted to remove the missiles from Cuba without provoking a war. Khrushchev wanted to remove the missiles while keeping Cuba safe in order to promote communism. Castro wanted to keep the missiles on his island to deter an attack from the U.S. and have the guarantee that the Soviet Union would destroy the U.S. if Cuba was attacked. As stated in our thesis, the Cuban Missile Crisis had a peaceful resolution because the leadership of Kennedy and Khrushchev emphasized three major characteristics: dismissal, mutual understanding, and rationality. Once aware of the missiles, the CIA drafted a document for Kennedy outlining 4 possible approaches and their predicted outcomes, in which it was clear they believed a full-on attack on Cuba was the best option. General LeMay called Kennedy, saying,
"I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this."
However, by choosing the quarantine, Kennedy showed that he knew he could not blindly listen to his advisors and that he prioritized the safety of the people over his own reputation. On Day 7, President Kennedy gave a speech informing the American people of the missiles in Cuba and called for their removal. Kennedy understood Khrushchev, as he knew that Khrushchev would not be willing to go to nuclear war. He wrote, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would, in this nuclear age, deliberately plunge the world into war which it is crystal clear no country could win and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world, including the aggressor."
John F. Kennedy was the first president to actually understand that nuclear weapons are not weapons. Nuclear weapons together, Russian and American nuclear weapons, is a doomsday machine.
On the 8th day, President Kennedy signed Proclamation 3504, authorizing the naval quarantine, and the ships moved into place. On this same day, Khrushchev decided that he would need to dismiss Castro, as he realized he was a threat to a peaceful resolution because he was in a different zone than he and Kennedy. Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs that, "It became clear to us that Fidel totally failed to understand our purpose. We installed the missiles not for the purpose of attacking the United States, but to keep the United States from attacking Cuba."
He was willing to sacrifice the island or go to that level. I mean, that makes him sound obviously outrageously reckless, right?
On day 12, Khrushchev offered the deal that was ultimately accepted, which showed that he followed through with what he believed was best and didn't let Castro's opinion sway him. On the 13th and final day, the US and Soviet Union reached an agreement regarding the removal of the missiles in Cuba. Khrushchev knew that Castro was upset about the deal that was made, so he tried to reassure him that he would continue to send weapons and that Cuba was still strong. Further, Khrushchev understood Kennedy, writing, "I regard with great understanding your concern and the concern of the United States people in connection with the fact that the weapons which you describe as offensive are formidable weapons indeed. Both you and we understand what kind of weapons these are." Ultimately, the deal was able to be agreed upon because Kennedy and Khrushchev were aware that things would have gone out of control and out of their power if they did not accept the deal.
The major lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is this: the indefinite combination of human fallibility and nuclear weapons will destroy nations.
This resulting new perception led to the first part of the legacy left behind by the Cuban Missile Crisis, a series of actions taken to reduce nuclear arms and the risk of nuclear war around the world. These actions were taken immediately after the crisis and continue to be taken today. Khrushchev and Kennedy were able to create the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which eliminated the right of any country to test nuclear weapons.
This limited treaty will radically reduce the nuclear testing which would otherwise be conducted on both sides.
The Non-Proliferation Treaty was open for signature in 1968 and currently has 190 states adhering to it. It deals with the rules on transferring nuclear weapons from one country to another, stating that the sharing of nuclear equipment is allowed only if it has been proven to help develop peaceful nuclear technology. On June 12, 1982, 1 million people protested in New York City against nuclear weapons and for an end to the Cold War arms race. It was the largest political demonstration in American history, proving that the general population would not allow nuclear weapons to be prevalent. The New START Treaty, created by Russia and the United States, reduces the number of nuclear warheads and launchers that each country can possess.
I think the fact that we are signing this treaty, the fact that we are willing as the two leading nuclear powers to continually work on reducing our own arsenals, I think should indicate the fact that we are willing to be bound by our obligation.
The second part of the legacy left behind by the Cuban Missile Crisis is that future and current leaders learned that if you can understand your opponent, you can avoid a crisis. The General Secretary for the Soviet Union, who took over in 1964 after Khrushchev was removed from power, wrote to President Reagan, "The lessening and liquidation of the threat of war depend upon the success of establishing more appropriate mutual understanding and effective cooperation, both bilaterally and multilaterally, in resolving the vital problems of present times." Kennedy and Khrushchev led by example during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as they each remained calm and examined their enemies' feelings and found a peaceful resolution to the problem at hand.